For sure. I mean, it bust wide open during COVID, but I think it's important to note that you very narrowly squeaked past Andrew Gillum in that last gubernatorial election, and then you quickly started consolidating support. By the time that COVID came about, you were already polling very well in the state because of your gubernatorial strategy, your governance strategy in the state. And then COVID hits, and suddenly the media decide that you are Satan, and Andrew Cuomo is going to be the haloed hero of COVID. And anybody who's watching what's going on understands that it's almost precisely the reverse in terms of which policy approach is being taken, both on a statistical level and also on a personal level. I mean, Andrew Cuomo is just yelling at people and bullying people and not taking account of anybody's needs as individual citizens. And I got to tell you, it made a huge difference for me and my wife. So our story of moving to Florida, because we were Californian, my wife since she was 12, me since birth. And I'd literally never spent any time outside of California living anywhere else except for 3 years in Cambridge. So only blue cities, only blue states. And COVID hits, they shut down every park. I couldn't take my kids to the park. They shut down every overpass on Mulholland Drive. They literally shut down like the turnouts on Mulholland Drive. Couldn't take my kids anywhere. And then the riots break out and they tell everybody you got to stay in your home, and they double curfew you. You can't go out because of COVID. And then they double curfew you at 6 p.m. You got to be home because we have to make space for people to riot. And we're hearing gunshots in our community and we're hearing helicopters overhead. And I said to my wife, maybe we should go visit Florida. I was trying to push her for 2 years. And finally we visit here. The first day, we walk off the plane. It's not overrun with homeless people. I don't see people shooting heroin into their feet in front of my children. I don't see rioters in the streets. And I make it sound like a dystopian hellhole, California, but that's only because it's become increasingly like a dystopian hellhole in some of the major cities. And so I think that, honestly, maybe the biggest thing was we came in, we hadn't had dinner as a couple out at a restaurant for 2 months. They shut down all the restaurants in LA. The first night we were here, we went to a restaurant. They were still eating outdoors. We ate outdoors at the restaurant because there was no evidence to suggest it was a problem. And I turned to my wife and I said, we could be doing this all the time. and it's a tribute to what the state of Florida is.
Well, the thing is I mean, just, your freedom to do that's important, but just think about all the people whose livelihoods depend on having an open economy. And I remember with the restaurants, Fauci's was railing about the restaurants probably sometime at the end of summer 2020. And I'm just thinking to myself, he wants all this closed. And I was like, I'm going to highlight what this means. So I did an event at a steakhouse down in South Florida. And yeah, we had the proprietor there, the owner, to talk about thanks, Governor DeSantis, for business. But I had the butcher there. He'd been there 24 years, said, I don't feed my family if we're not open. I had the bartender. I had the servers. I had all these people throughout the organization come through. And in a state like Florida, if we had done like California lockdown, we have a service-based economy between our lodging, our parks, our restaurants. And so we were able to keep those afloat. In fact, August of 2021, we did better than August of 2019 pre-COVID. Hotel reservations, receipts in terms of revenue, restaurant reservations. And so it just shows you that freedom works. And look, people vote with their feet. If the media was right and that these other states, the New Yorks and that, were the right way and Florida did the wrong way, then you would see people leaving Florida to flock to those states. And in fact, you see the opposite. And so I think it's been interesting because the media's tried to gaslight on this, and it's obviously nobody believes what the corporate press says anymore because people are beating a pathway here. And even these lockdown governors and lockdown mayors, they would lock down their state or lock down their city, and then they'd show up in my state out at the pool drinking a margarita. And it was like clockwork that would happen throughout COVID.
So in a second, I want to ask you about how you came up with your COVID strategy, because it wasn't a pure red-blue thing at the very beginning. There were some red states, Maryland for one, that sort of locked down in terms of the governor. Ohio was much more locked down, but you decided not to go that route. Okay, so let's talk about how you came up with sort of your COVID approach, because obviously there were some red governors who decided to go in the more lockdown direction. There were a few blue governors, like Jared Polis in Colorado, who seemed to be a little bit looser, but you, from the very get-go, were analyzing the data and you were looking at the data, and you basically said from the start that we need to protect the elderly and we need to make sure that everybody else can get back to work and re-enter something approaching normal life. How'd you come up with that strategy?
Well, I think there were two main things. I mean, one is we were all given these models about the hospitalization spikes that would happen. And they were literally predicting like 10 times the number of patients than we even had hospital beds in all the states throughout the United States. I mean, hundreds of thousands of patients they were predicting in Florida. You know, we've got about 65,000 licensed beds at a given time. And so you're looking at that. In New York, they were predicting even more, the ventilators, all the stuff. But then in real time, I'm looking, okay, March 21st, they said we're going to have 4,000. We have 1,000. Next day, we have 1,010 instead of 4,300. And so the models clearly were wrong. And the whole reason this, quote, 15 days to slow the spread was to prevent hospital overcrowding. And it was clear to me that, yes, a place like New York, if you had an outbreak like that, it would bend, but it wasn't clear to me that it would break. And I think that's been true throughout COVID. Then the other thing was you started to get research out of Stanford looking at the seroprevalence data. In other words, how many people have actually had it. And what they found was most people that had it had modest or no symptoms. And so the mortality rate was much less than what the WHO had said. Yeah, high, relatively high for elderly people if you have certain comorbidities. But for the vast majority of people, it would be something that would likely not present the risk of hospitalization or death. And so I thought those two factors meant you got to have society open. We can target protection to people that need it, to elderly. And so that was initially making sure nursing homes were not having pay. We barred sending sick patients back into nursing homes, make sure we protected that. I sent National Guard to do tests on nursing homes if there was ever an outbreak. We prioritized elderly for vaccination. And then we've done the monoclonal antibodies where we're getting early treatment to people. And we're 100% about doing that. But to kneecap your whole society, and here's the thing, it doesn't stop the virus. It'd be one thing if we could all just go in a cave for 2 weeks and the virus would disappear, but that is not true. So you're gonna have to deal with it. And I think we're finding that out now because you look, some of these very highly vaccinated countries in Europe are having massive spikes, Vermont in the United States hitting records. So that's just the reality. And I think that living with it and not destroying your society was something that made sense. And quite frankly, was what the literature up until COVID for pandemic preparedness had said. They always said, don't let the fear overcome society. You have to keep things going. You've got to keep people in a good state of mind. Give them accurate information. And it seemed like our leaders like Fauci, they would try to ratchet up the fear, and they ended up spooking a lot of people. And there's some people that really haven't gotten over that even today, particularly in some of those deep blue enclaves.
It's 100% true. I mean, I have family members who are very paranoid about COVID after being triple vaxxed. And I think that sort of mentality has pervaded because when you have the highest members of the highest scientific institutions in the land telling you over and over and over what risks you're undergoing by seeing your grandkids post-vaccination. A lot of people take that to heart. Were you freaked out at all at the very beginning by the amount of media blowback that you got? Because you would imagine that in a normal society that there would be at least a little bit of tolerance for the fact that nobody knew anything about the virus. What we did know suggested that there were several different strategies that could be undertaken to be charitable to some of the other folks who took a different strategy. And then as the data began to emerge, it became clear that Florida was actually not collapsing, that Florida was actually doing relatively well next to states like California, well, really next states like New York and New Jersey particularly. And yet the media decided that you were the villain of COVID from the get-go, from the jump. You were the villain of COVID. Well, did you find that surprising at all?
No, because I think they started weaponizing COVID against Trump, and I think their meta-narrative was, Trump was bad. That's why they elevated people like Cuomo, because they were saying this is true leadership opposed to Trump. So I think that was, and then me as a Republican governor in a key state, I think I was target number 2, and so I think that's just typical what they do. The corporate press creates partisan narratives. They don't care about the facts. I mean, there's a lot of facts about COVID they still won't recognize to this day. But I also think there was a lot of pressure on the media from some of these scientific elites. They didn't want a control group because they were advocating policies that were going to have a hugely detrimental effect to the social fabric. And if you could show a Sweden or a Florida or some of these other places that didn't pay those terrible costs and still had similar outcomes in terms of COVID, then it would show that what they were advocating was not only misguided, but it was actually harmful. And I think that was part of the reason. It was, you have these scientists like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kaldor, they will speak out, they get absolutely killed because I think these people don't want to have any evidence that people can point to say they were wrong about this from the beginning. And in fact, if you look, the corporate press has been wrong about this time and time again. They shilled for lockdowns. The lockdowns didn't stop COVID. They said forced masking would end the pandemic in the summer of 2020. Didn't end the pandemic. They said if 50% were vaccinated, you wouldn't have surges. People like Fauci said that. That obviously isn't true. So time and time, they said schools needed to be closed. They said schools would drive the pandemic if schools were open. Well, Florida, we had schools open and it didn't do that. And so they've been wrong time and time again. But at the end of the day, they see all this through a partisan prism. I reject their worldview. They view me, I think, as a threat to their worldview. And so I think that I'm a target. But I'll tell you, I view that positively. I think that when you're fighting back against leftist narratives and leftist policies, if they're attacking you, it means because you're getting traction. And I think people around the country started looking to Florida and they were like, hey, you know, this guy's doing the right thing. And that's why people have poured in here. And not just people moving here. We're by far the #1 vacation destination. Now, we've always been a top one, but I can't tell you the number of people I've run into over the last year and a half from lockdown states that are just like, thank you, Governor, for letting me be here for 2 weeks and be sane instead of suffering under some of the draconian policies that they were having to in these left-wing states.
I'm amazed at the number of lies the media told over the course of this pandemic about you and about Florida particularly. So they lied when they said, for example, that monoclonal antibodies they didn't work. They lied when they suggested that you were falsifying the death data, which they kept suggesting over and over and over. They lied when they said that you were killing kids because you were telling parents that they didn't need to mask their kids or that masks should be optional for their kids. I mean, they just lied routinely throughout the pandemic. They continue to lie about the idea that you're somehow downplaying the efficacy of vaccines when I was here when the vaccines rolled out and you were telling everybody who could to get vaccinated and you were prioritizing the most vulnerable.
And here's the thing, though. So, like, let's take the school masking. We put the kids in school and it's gone down 90-some% since the kids went into school. And these are overwhelmingly kids not wearing masks. So they were wrong about that. They will never admit that. They will never come to terms with that data. The vaccines, they attack me because I said the efficacy wanes after a certain time. Now Fauci is out there saying that. He says you need a regimen because after 6 months or so, people are more liable to get infected. The clinical data for Pfizer was 95% protection against infection and 100% protection against hospitalization and death. That may be true initially, but the protection wanes. And so I pointed that out months ago because Israel's data showed that, the UK showed it, and now our data in the United States shows it. And they say that somehow I was downplaying when all I was doing was accurately describing what we were talking about. That was one of the reasons why we needed to do the monoclonals, because people that were fully vaccinated were getting infected in Florida this summer. And many of these people are the most vulnerable people. And so they have a breakthrough infection, they go, they get it, and most of them invariably were very happy with that treatment. But the monoclonal lies they told, that may have killed some people because we went out there, it was clinically proven, and I would say of all the things that have been put out, this has performed 100% in line with the clinical trial data. It reduces hospitalizations and deaths by the amount that they said it would. And we have so many firsthand examples of that. But they acted like this was some type of scam that we were trying to provide early treatment. There very well may be people who believe these media narratives who got COVID and rejected seeking monoclonal antibody treatments and may have had a negative outcome. So it just shows you they're more interested in pursuing a narrative than in informing the public in a factual way when even members of the public's lives could be at stake here with a COVID infection and early treatment.
Let's talk about the conflict between the state of Florida and the federal government.
'Cause the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that